Hey everyone, I'm Kate from the Backdrop Studio. In today's video, I want to show you a couple different ways that you can use your digital backdrops to add that extra special something to your images. Let's get started. Today I'm going to be showing you a few different ways in which you can add a digital backdrop to your image. But first I wanted to talk about what a digital backdrop actually is and why you might find it useful. So a digital backdrop is just what it sounds like. It's a digital file. It comes to you in high-res JPEG format that you can add to an existing image you might have of a subject with a different background. Digital backdrops are awesome for a lot of reasons. If you're in a tight space and you can't get a full-size backdrop behind you, if you don't have the budget for a printed backdrop, if you don't like the existing backdrop that's already in the image, or if you just can't find a physical backdrop in the style that you like, then a digital backdrop is a great affordable alternative. And today I'm just going to show you how you can put them to use with only a little bit of extra work in Photoshop. The first method I want to cover today is what I cleverly like to call the cutout method, because it's really just cutting out a subject and layering it over the background file. So first I'm going to start by opening our subject layer here. And then I'm going to open our digital backdrop file as well. I'm going to go to our sunset storm image here and pull this up. I think the clouds are going to be a nice touch, a nice fit with the background file that we have. So let's just put these side by side here. And I need to get these to the same file. So what I'm going to do is just drag and drop my background file onto my higher res image file here, and I'm just going to hit shift when I drag my layer over, just so it kind of ends up in sort of the same location. And I'm just going to make sure that I put my backdrop layer underneath my subject layer, because we're going to cut around her to reveal our background below. Okay, so there are a number of ways that we can cut out our subject here. Since we have some pretty nice clean edges around her, separating her from the background, she doesn't have a lot of frizzy hair sticking out, I'm going to let Photoshop kind of work its magic here, and I'm going to use the magnetic lasso tool and just kind of slowly and carefully create an outline around her. Might have to do some finessing where there's not a lot of contrast, but it's a pretty good place to start. Now that I've got a nice clean mask selection here, I'll just make sure that my subject layer is selected, and I'm going to click on my layer mask button right here. And voila, I should have a nice image that reveals my background underneath. Easy peasy. Now at this point I can adjust my backdrop file or my subject file. I can change her size, make her smaller, make her larger to fit into the frame, you know, kind of positioning your subject however makes sense. Or I can do the same thing with my backdrop as well. It's a little bit bigger than the frame of the image, so I might come in and just kind of tweak that a little bit. Just have fun with it, play around. See what works best in terms of the composition of your image. So I think that looks pretty good right there. Now this background happens to match the subject pretty perfectly, so I think we could just leave it at this and be fine. But not all of our digital backdrops are necessarily going to work perfectly without a little finessing. So I'm going to demonstrate a different backdrop just to give you an example. So let's open up another backdrop file here. I'm going back into our cloud collection, and I am going to select the heaven backdrop. Close out of that guy, and again I'm just going to drag my background layer here. So now we have a different layer. She's already cut out, so we don't have to do that work again, and we can kind of move around this background layer however we want. Maybe resize it as well. Just kind of play around and see what makes sense. And one of the things that I'm noticing is that I like the clouds. I think it adds a nice quality to the image, but I think it is a little bit too bright and the color's a little bit off. So I'm going to demonstrate how we can make some adjustments to that and really make this a seamless image. Now, the most obvious issue that we have is that the background seems to be quite a bit brighter than our subject. So I'm going to adjust that using a curves layer, and there are a number of different ways that we can adjust luminosity, but a curve is a pretty quick and efficient way to do that. So I might come in and drop my highlights down a little bit and then just pull the whole thing down a little bit more. So now we're starting to see how the luminosity is starting to blend a little bit better with our subject here. Our highlights are kind of in the same range as are the shadows, so that's going to make it a little bit more believable and make it seem like she's actually in the scene. We also have a little bit of color issue. She's a little bit more purple in the clouds around here, and I might just come in with a hue and adjustment, or a hue saturation adjustment layer, pull that up, and just kind of start playing around here. I might try to get some of these tans a little bit more evenly distributed throughout the backdrop. So what I'll do is I'll colorize and kind of pull my hue a little bit over. So now I'm kind of in a similar range, and I'll bring my saturation down some too. And it feels a little bit too uniform now, so I'm just going to take the opacity of my hue saturation layer and just bring it down. So if I toggle that on and off, you'll see it's a subtle shift, but it just helps to blend with our subject a little bit better. So this is looking pretty good. Now we can get to the fun stuff, which is making the adjustments for global color grading. And notice how these layers were created basically in between our background layer and our subject layer, so they were only affecting our background. Now I might come on top and apply a global adjustment layer to help sort of blend everything together a little bit more. And this is where your personal style comes in. If you have a color grade that you normally gravitate towards, or if you like warm tones or cool tones, you know, this is about kind of exploring what really makes your style you. So like I said, a number of ways we can do this. I might come in with a gradient map, for instance, and bring my opacity way down here, and then just kind of start toggling through until I see something that looks interesting. Maybe something like that. And it's pretty subtle, but it brings all of the tones into a little bit more of a consistent realm and just ties everything together a little bit better. So I think that is about it for this particular image. Next, I'm going to show you how to add a digital backdrop using the overlay method. To demonstrate the overlay method, I've pulled up this image of a girl in a red dress, and I want to use the pond digital backdrop from the landscape collection to add to this image. Now, I like the pond for her for a couple of different reasons. One is the color palette. So the reds from the trees and the leaves ties in really nicely with the colors in her dress. And we also have this kind of orange tone to the landscape behind the pond that matches really well with her hair and her skin tones as well. The other reason I like the pond for this is her pose leans back a little bit. So she's got a little bit of a lean. And I think this is going to work really well with the composition of the pond backdrop because of the opening in the sky and how it kind of pulls up to the right. So let's drag that, drop that on top of that and see how it looks. So I'm going to use the same method that I did before. I'm going to select our backdrop layer here. I'm going to hit Shift and I'm going to drag it on top of our subject layer. And now you'll see that they're kind of in the same kind of alignment here. So let's close out of this. Now you'll notice that the backdrop is now on top of the subject file as opposed to the last method where we had our backdrop underneath. In this method, we're not going to cut her out. We're actually going to use blend modes to integrate the backdrop into the image. Now, if you're not familiar with blend modes, they're basically a way in which your layers can interact with one another. So our blend modes are here, and this top layer are what I call the darken blend modes. So darken, multiply, color burn, etc. And you can see when we set our blend mode to one of these, we're making the image darker. And now for this particular image, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. Our initial backdrop is already darker than the one we want to bring in. So this is just going to make the whole image darker, and it's not really going to work for this particular image. The next group are the lighten blend modes. So we've got lighten, screen, color dodge, linear dodge, and lighter color. And you can see now how this is actually bringing up the luminosity of the image as a whole. I think one of these is probably going to work really well. I like either screen or linear dodge for this one. I think I'm going to go with screen. And right now I'm just kind of paying attention to how the background looks, and I'm not worrying so much about her at this particular instance because we're going to fix that in a minute. Right, now let's fix our lady so she's not so much of a transparent ghost here. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to come down here and click this little guy and add a layer mask to my background layer. Then I'm going to go over to my tool palette here and select my brush. Make sure it's set to black, and my flow is going to be fairly low, somewhere around 15 to 20%. And then with a fairly large brush, I'm just going to come in and kind of mask out anywhere where we have the background kind of shining through on her a little bit. And I use a soft brush so that I don't get any really hard edges. That's going to make it really obvious where our kind of background starts and where she begins. So I'm just focusing on areas where that background is really bleeding through a lot here. Maybe come in here and focus a little bit on her arm. And I'm getting a little bit of that background masked out too. I'm not too worried about that right this minute. Any mistake you can make, you can just switch your brush back to white. And this is just to kind of give you a general sense of her placement in the image. We'll kind of tweak some things here to make it fit in a little bit better in a second. But yeah, just kind of brushing her out so now she feels a little bit more lively, shall we say. Okay, so now that we've masked her out, a couple things that I want to take a look at here, and one is just kind of the ratio between the shadows in the background layer and the foreground layer, and the same with the highlights. And I think what we could do here is come in and maybe drop down the luminosity of the background layer, and that way they'll fit together a little bit better. And so how I'm going to do that is I'm going to create another curves layer here. And I am going to clip this to our background layer. Now to clip it, you just hit Alt or Command, maybe? Option? Sorry, I'm not a Mac user. Alt, and then you'll see this little box here, and you're going to click the layer below. And what this does is it basically says that any adjustments that we've made here on this mask are going to affect this layer, but it's not going to affect anywhere where it's blacked out. So if I come in and bring this down or bring it way up, you'll notice that it's affecting only the background layer above and not the layer below. So if I had unclipped this, and you can Alt unclick, now you'll see that if it's just a global adjustment, it's also affecting her. So I'm going to clip that back again and kind of bring this to maybe this point here, which I think helps really bring the haloing down around her hair a little bit. It definitely blends in a little bit more and makes it so that the mask that we created doesn't have to be so precise. Okay, so now that our luminosities are balanced a little bit better, this might be a point where I could come in and refine my mask a little bit more. And I might just come in maybe here along the edge of her dress. Again, I'm using a pretty low flow, so I might just kind of mask that in a little bit more there. Maybe kind of focus around the edges here. And again, you can use that magic wand lasso tool in Photoshop as well if you want to at this point. I'm just hitting X to switch between my black and my white brushes here. But areas like her arm, where we do have more of a kind of a defined edge, if you wanted to come in and get a little bit more technical with your mask, that would be a good place to do it. She's got a lot of these flyaways and frizz on her head, so I don't want to get too crazy with that. And maybe I'm just kind of going outside the bounds here a little bit and put a little bit of maybe a shadow onto the background. And again, this is all just kind of artistic preference at this point, but I want to keep this brush as big as possible so that it is a pretty subtle and natural looking blend into the background. From here, I think we're at a point where we can start playing around with our global color grade or run an action or something along those lines to start giving it that kind of finishing touch. And I'm going to run one of my favorite actions here. I like to very creatively call this the painterly action, because as you'll see in a second, when we run it, it gives the image kind of a painterly quality to it. There we go, starting to feel a little bit more like a painting, don't you think? It feels a little bit too much for me, so I'm actually just going to back down on the opacity just a little bit. And I might also come in here and create a layer mask for our action and create a little bit of a vignette so it's not, there's a little bit more contrast around the edge. So I can just do that with our gradient map tool here. And I've got it set to the radial gradient map here. Oops. And let's see, let's try slightly different. Okay, so now it's really just kind of affecting her skin tones, and the outside still has a little bit of that contrast that we originally had. Now I'm pretty happy with this as is, but I want to demonstrate one more thing to you, and that is how you can actually layer some of these digital backdrops to create a little bit more depth in your images. So I'm going to open up, let's see, let's get out of our landscape collection and go back into the clouds. I'm actually going to open up this heaven action, or sorry, heaven backdrop one more time. And I am going to drag and drop this, shift drag on top, close out of that. And once again, I'm going to start playing with the different blend modes. And this is just a lot of trial and error and kind of going through and seeing what you like, what your preferences are. Multiply is kind of cool if you want to give it a bit of a darker look. I might go with an overlay or a soft light. Soft light actually looks pretty nice here. but it's a bit much, so again, I'm just going to come down on my opacity a little bit. And by the way, you can come down on, you can adjust the opacity of any of your layers. So if I want to bring my pond layer down, for instance, something like that, you know, I can adjust that too. You have a lot of control here on what you want to showcase. So going back to my Heaven soft light layer, I'm gonna just create another layer mask here and just brush a little bit out of her face and her arms and a little bit of her body, just so we're not creating texture where we don't really want it. And I think that looks pretty good. So there you have it, folks. That's 2 different ways to add your digital backdrops in Photoshop using either the cutout method or the overlay method. I cannot wait to see what you guys come up with. Feel free to send us your imagery or tag us online. We're The Backdrop Studio on Facebook and at The Backdrop Studio on Instagram. That's all for today, and we'll see you next time.